My name is Walter, and I am 72 years old. I built a chain of hardware and lumber supply stores across Ohio from a single rented storefront in Dayton, and I thought that after 4 decades of work, I had finally earned the right to sit still. 2 weekends ago, my family gathered at the Baldwin estate outside Columbus to celebrate my granddaughter Emily's engagement party, a night I paid $94,000 to host because nothing was too good for that girl. Between the toasts and the string quartet, my son Gregory raised his glass to me from across the room, and his wife Patricia squeezed my hand under the table like she always does, warm and familiar. I simply nodded back at both of them and finished my champagne. I did not know it yet, but that toast was the opening note of my own funeral march. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, neighbor, because a story like this deserves company. And if you have ever had people you loved look you dead in the eye while lying to you, hit that like button right now, because you already know exactly where this is going. I grew up the son of a factory foreman in Toledo, and my father taught me that a man's word and a man's work were the only two things nobody could ever take from him. I carried that into everything I built. When my wife Eleanor passed 11 years ago, I promised her on her deathbed that I would keep our family whole, that Gregory would never want for anything, that little Emily would grow up knowing what it meant to be loved without condition. I kept that promise with everything I had. I put Gregory through business school. I gave him the vice president title at my company before he'd earned a single day of it, telling myself a father's love doesn't need to be earned. I bought Patricia her dream kitchen renovation. I paid for Emily's private school, her horseback riding lessons, her semester abroad in Florence. I told myself that blood was blood, and that the people who shared your name would never be the ones to put a knife in your back. 4 days after the engagement party, that illusion collapsed into dust. I was sitting on the back porch of my house in Upper Arlington on a gray Tuesday morning, drinking black coffee and reading the paper the old-fashioned way, when my private cell rang. I figured it was my accountant calling about the quarterly numbers. Instead, it was Marcus, the events director at the Baldwin estate, the venue where we'd held the engagement dinner. His voice had none of the smooth, practiced warmth I remembered from planning the event with him. It was thin and shaking, like a man forcing himself to make a call he desperately did not want to make. He told me the security team had gone back through the footage from the private dining room that morning, routine review after a client complained about a missing coat, and they'd found something that made him physically sick. He said I needed to come see it myself, in person, today. He asked me to come alone, and then he said the words that have not left my head since. Whatever you do, Walter, do not tell your son. Do not tell Patricia. Come by yourself. The drive from Upper Arlington to the Baldwin estate is normally 18 minutes. That morning it felt like 18 years. My mind ran through every possible explanation, searching desperately for something small enough to make the dread in my chest go away. Had someone gotten too drunk and caused a scene I'd missed while I was making my rounds greeting guests? Had there been a fight in the parking lot? None of those explanations answered the one question sitting like a stone in my stomach. Why would a security tape from my own granddaughter's engagement party require me to hide something from my own son? Gregory was my blood, my only child. The boy I had carried on my shoulders through the Ohio State Fair, the young man I had walked down the aisle at his own wedding to give away, in a manner of speaking, because his own father had passed before he could be there. I had built my entire second half of life around the belief that whatever happened, Gregory was in my corner. When I arrived, Marcus was waiting for me in a small back office, and he wouldn't look me in the eye as he turned the monitor toward me. The footage was time-stamped from nearly 2 hours before the party officially began, back when the room was supposed to be empty, back when I was still upstairs getting dressed. On the screen, Patricia walked into the private dining room alone, checking over her shoulder twice before pulling out her phone and making a call. A man walked in a few minutes later. Not a caterer, not a member of the estate staff. A man in an expensive gray suit I did not recognize, who Patricia embraced like she had known him far longer and far more intimately than any daughter-in-law should know a stranger. They spoke for 6 minutes with their heads close together. At one point, Patricia laughed, covered her mouth, and said something that made the man reach into his jacket and hand her a thick manila envelope, which she slid immediately into her purse. Then, right before they separated, the man said something short, and Patricia's face changed completely. The warmth drained out of it. What replaced it was cold, calculating, almost businesslike. She nodded once, like she was confirming an order at a restaurant, and walked out to rejoin the party as if nothing had happened at all. Marcus told me there was no audio on that particular camera, some wiring issue from a renovation 2 years back. But he wanted me to see it because the man in the suit was, and this was the part that made my hands go numb, a name he recognized. Marcus had catered a corporate retreat 8 months earlier for a private wealth firm downtown, and that same man had been introduced to the room as a specialist in estate liquidation and asset restructuring. In plain English, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, that man's entire profession is helping people take apart what other people spent their lives building. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for 45 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I did not confront Patricia. I did not confront Gregory. Something old and quiet inside me, some instinct my father had passed down through the factory floor and the union halls of Toledo, told me that the moment I showed my hand, whatever this was would simply vanish back into the shadows and reform somewhere I couldn't see it. So instead, that night at dinner, I did something I am not proud of, but something I have come to understand, saved my life. I began to act different, not dramatically, just subtly. I misplaced my reading glasses twice at the table. I called Emily by her mother's name once, and immediately looked confused and embarrassed. I let my hand tremble slightly when I reached for my water glass. I watched, out of the corner of my eye, as Patricia and Gregory exchanged a look across the table, quick as a blink, that I was not meant to see. Over the following 2 weeks, I built a performance more careful than anything I had ever done in 40 years of business negotiations. I started repeating questions I had already asked an hour earlier, watching Gregory answer patiently, while something flickered behind his eyes that was not patience at all. I let it slip. In what looked like an unguarded moment, that my doctor had mentioned some concerns about my memory during a routine physical, a doctor's appointment that never happened, a doctor's concern I invented whole cloth. I watched that piece of false information travel through my family like wildfire, watched Patricia begin speaking to me slower and louder. The way people speak to a man they've already decided is disappearing. What I was not prepared for was how quickly the mask slipped once they believed I couldn't see clearly anymore. Gregory began stopping by my study in the evenings, always with paperwork, always with a warm smile and a story about updating my insurance or streamlining my estate documents for tax purposes. He would slide papers in front of me buried between real documents I actually needed to sign, hoping the volume would exhaust my attention before I reached the ones that mattered. I signed nothing without reading every line twice in the privacy of my own bedroom at midnight, my reading glasses perfectly steady in my perfectly steady hands, and what I found in those documents turned my blood to ice water. Buried in the language of a routine power of attorney update was a clause that would transfer full authority over my company's holding trust to Gregory, effective the moment two physicians I had never heard of, signed off on a diagnosis of cognitive decline. I understood then that the man in the gray suit had not been hired to help Patricia hide money. He had been hired to help her and my son build the paper trail to take my entire company out from under me while I was still breathing. I did not sign. I told Gregory, in my slow, forgetful new voice, that I wanted to think about it, that these things confused me now, and I watched real frustration cross his face before he caught himself and smiled again. Patient, so patient, the patience of a man who believes he only has to wait a little longer. That was when I called Dale. Dale Whitfield had been my head of corporate security for 22 years, a former Columbus police detective who had never once in 2 decades given me a reason to doubt him. I met him at a diner 40 minutes outside the city, somewhere no one from my family would ever think to look for me, and I told him everything. The footage, the documents, the doctors who did not exist. Dale did not look surprised so much as grimly unsurprised, the way a man looks when a suspicion he'd been quietly nursing finally gets confirmed. He told me he had noticed unusual financial activity months earlier, transfers between accounts connected to Patricia's family, but had assumed it was none of his business. Not anymore, I told him. Now it was exactly his business. We built a system together over the following 10 days, working only at night, only when the house was empty, using a small, unused office space above my downtown store that no one in my family had visited in years. Dale installed cameras with audio in every room of my house where the family gathered, the kitchen, the study, the master bedroom, even the guest suite where Patricia's brother stayed whenever he visited from Cleveland. We ran everything back to a bank of monitors in that upstairs office. Feeds I could watch from my phone, recordings that saved automatically to a drive Dale kept in a location only the two of us knew. For the next 3 weeks, I played the fading old man during the day, and at night, alone in that little office above my own hardware store, I watched my family with the clear, cold eyes of a man who was very much still himself. What I learned in those 3 weeks nearly broke something in me that I am not sure has ever fully healed. Patricia had married Gregory 11 years ago, the same year I lost Eleanor, and the timing, I came to understand, had not been an accident. She had spent over a decade patiently, methodically, positioning herself inside my family, learning the company, learning the trust structure, waiting for the moment I would be old enough and trusting enough for the plan to work. Gregory, my son, the boy I raised, had not been an unwilling victim of her scheme. He had been an eager partner in it, complaining on camera about how many more years he might have to wait, joking with Patricia in our own kitchen about which of my properties they would sell first, laughing together about how easy I had become to fool. The worst night was the one where I watched them discuss the doctors. Patricia had a cousin, it turned out, who worked as a nurse practitioner and had agreed, for a fee already wired into an account overseas, to falsify a preliminary cognitive assessment. A second physician, a semi-retired neurologist with gambling debts, Patricia's associate in the gray suit, had apparently discovered and quietly offered to help settle, would provide the second signature needed to legally declare me incompetent. Once that declaration was filed, the power of attorney documents I had refused to sign would become unnecessary. A court would simply hand my authority to Gregory, whether I agreed or not. They were planning to have me declared legally incompetent while I sat 40 feet above them, watching every word on a monitor, more clear-headed than I had been in years. I want to tell you that my next move was rage. It was not. It was something colder and steadier than rage, something my father would have recognized. The particular quiet of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do and simply needs the world to catch up to him. I called an old friend from my Rotary Club, a woman named Judge Constance Yablonsky, who had sat on the Franklin County bench for 18 years before retiring to private elder law practice, specifically because she had seen this exact scheme play out in other families more times than she could count. I met her at her office with Dale and with the recordings, and I watched her expression go from professional calm to something much harder as the footage played. She told me that what my family was attempting had a name: elder financial exploitation combined with attempted fraudulent guardianship, and that it was prosecuted far more aggressively than most people realized, especially when there was documented evidence of intent. But she told me something else too, something that mattered more to me than any statute. She said the recordings alone would not be enough to truly protect me long-term, because Patricia and Gregory could simply claim the whole thing was a misunderstanding, a bad joke taken out of context. What I needed, she said, was for them to act. I needed them to actually attempt the fraud in a way that left no room for interpretation. So we let it play out one more turn. I called Gregory myself and told him, in my slow, uncertain voice, that I had been thinking about what he said, that maybe it was time to make things easier, that I wanted the family to sit down together with the new doctors he mentioned and talk it through. No pressure, just a conversation. I have never in my life heard my son sound as happy as he did on that phone call. 3 days later, the false neurologist and the nurse practitioner, Patricia's cousin, arrived at my house for what my family believed was a private, quiet, uncontested cognitive evaluation designed to end with a signature I would be too confused to properly understand. What they did not know was that Judge Yablonsky had already contacted the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Abuse Task Force, and that 2 investigators posing as visiting family friends were sitting in my living room when the fake doctors arrived, and that every word spoken in that room was already being recorded through Dale's system for the 3rd week running, this time with full legal chain of custody. I sat in my armchair and let the nurse practitioner walk me through a series of questions designed to make me look confused. Questions about the date, about the president, about simple math, and I answered every single one wrong on purpose, watching Patricia's face across the room glow with something close to joy. Then, when the neurologist asked me to sign the preliminary assessment form acknowledging the evaluation, I looked up, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I let my voice come back to its full, steady strength. I told them I would be happy to sign. Right after they explained to the two federal investigators sitting on my couch exactly how much they were being paid, and by whom, and for what. The silence in that room was the loudest sound I have heard in my entire life. Patricia's face went the color of old paper. Gregory, my son, stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth opening and closing without a single word coming out, a grown man reduced in one instant to something smaller than the boy I used to carry on my shoulders. The fake neurologist tried to bolt for the front door and was stopped gently but firmly by one of the investigators, who informed him he was not under arrest yet, but that he would want to sit back down immediately. The nurse practitioner began crying almost instantly, the kind of crying that comes from a person who has just watched every version of their future collapse at once. I stood up from my chair, and I want you to understand I felt no triumph in that moment, only a deep, exhausted grief, the grief of a man who has just watched proof that his own son was willing to erase him for money. I told Gregory that I had loved his mother for 39 years and had promised her on the day she died that I would keep this family whole, and that he and Patricia had made that promise impossible to keep. I told him I hoped, somewhere far in the future, he would understand what he had actually done, not to a company, not to a fortune, but to a father who had never once, in 72 years, stopped trying to give him everything. The federal charges took another 4 months to fully process. Patricia and Gregory were both charged with conspiracy to commit elder fraud and attempted fraudulent guardianship, felonies carrying, given the scale of the assets involved, sentences that stunned even Judge Yablonsky. The fake neurologist lost his license permanently and is currently serving 18 months. The nurse practitioner cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence and testified against the others, including the man in the gray suit, who turned out to be under investigation in 2 other states for nearly identical schemes targeting elderly business owners. Patricia is currently serving a 9-year federal sentence. Gregory, my son, my only child, is serving 6. Emily, my granddaughter, was 22 years old and had no knowledge of any of it. I want to be very clear about that, neighbor, because I know some of you are wondering. She came to me 2 weeks after the arrests, sat on my porch, and cried for almost an hour, apologizing for things she never did, terrified I would somehow blame her for her mother's choices. I told her the truth, that the only thing I blame her for is being born into a family that did not deserve her, and that as long as I have breath in my body, she will never again have to wonder whether she is loved without condition. It has been 8 months now since the arrests. I sold the majority stake in my company to a longtime employee I trusted completely, someone who had worked the floor of my very first store back when I was still stocking shelves myself, and I kept enough to know I will never want for anything for the rest of my life. I moved into a smaller home closer to Emily's apartment, and most evenings she comes by for dinner, and we talk about everything except the 2 people who are no longer welcome at either of our tables. I still keep Dale on retainer, not out of fear anymore, but out of gratitude, and out of the quiet understanding that vigilance is not the opposite of trust. It is simply what allows trust to exist safely in the first place. I sit on my porch most nights now with a cup of coffee instead of scotch, because at 72, I have decided I would rather remember every single moment of the years I have left. I think about my father sometimes, about the factory floor and the union halls, about a man's word being the only thing nobody can take from him. I understand now that he was almost entirely right, except for one thing he never got the chance to teach me, because he never had to learn it himself. Your word protects you from the world. It does not always protect you from the people closest to you. Sometimes the ones who know exactly how much you love them are the ones best positioned to use it against you, and the only defense against that is never letting love replace your eyes. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit that subscribe button and give it a like, neighbor, because stories like mine deserve to be heard by people who understand what it means to build something with your whole life and then have to fight to keep it. Has someone you deeply trusted ever tried to convince the world you were losing your mind, just so they could take what was yours? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I promise you, whatever you went through, you are not alone in this. I will see you next time.